Welcome. Today we're joined by Dr. Laurence Broers, Chatham House Fellow and expert on the South Caucasus. Laurence, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
You recently released a new book which was co-edited by Anna Ohanyan, entitled Armenia's Velvet Revolution, Authoritarian Decline and Civil Resistance in a Multipolar World. Can you tell us a bit about it and why you wrote it, as well as why you attach an importance to a multipolar world?
Sure. Well, thank you for asking about the book. Here it is. As you said, it's entitled Armenia's Velvet Revolution, Authoritarian Decline and Civil Resistance in a Multipolar World. It's a co-edited volume written with a collective of scholars and analysts both inside Armenia and beyond, some of whom I think are regular guests on CivilNet. And what we tried to do with this book, if you recall, at the time of the Velvet Revolution, the default framework for understanding those events was the color revolution paradigm, as happened in Ukraine and Georgia and other locations. And so the effort was very much to interpret events in Armenia in terms of Eurasia's contested geopolitics and Russian-Western competition. And what we tried to do in this book is to broaden out the prisms through which we look at the Velvet Revolution. So we have a heavy comparative politics focus. Anna's chapter looks at the Velvet in terms of where it's located on the spectrum of global democratic transitions. We have a number of chapters that look at the tradition of dissidence and protest in Armenia, going back to 1988 and then successive contestations of elections in 1996, 2008 most notoriously, and then the civic initiatives since then. And we also look at this idea of authoritarian decline, so why the Republican Party regime was much more vulnerable than perhaps we thought, and why it crumbled so quickly. There are also very interesting, rich chapters on the roles of diaspora and political patriarchy. And of course, we don't forget geopolitics. Richard Girogosyan has written a very strong chapter on the geopolitical context for the Velvet, and there's a chapter on Russia's reaction or lack of reaction too. So you asked about the importance of a multipolar world. Well, this is a reference to the emerging post-American, post-liberal global order in which we see America's exit from hegemony, to quote the title of a famous book, and the rise of a number of other global and regional powers, many of whom are more invested in authoritarian modes of governance. And so it's important because in one sense, it's a rather not a very propitious moment for a democratic transition. There's not the external support that there might have been in an earlier time. But it also means that there are opportunities and the necessity to craft a more creative foreign policy, and actually to put more content into this idea of complementarity, which, as you know, structures Armenia's foreign policy, not just between Euro-Atlantic and Russia forces, but a number of other actors on the global stage. So yeah, that's the book.
Since last time we spoke, the 2020 skirmishes occurred. Azerbaijan has been decrying what it calls Armenian aggression. Armenia at the same time has been portraying the skirmishes as a sort of victory for Armenian forces, and also evidence that there can be no use of force in terms of a resolution to the conflict with Azerbaijan. What is your perception of the 2020 skirmishes, and what does it mean for Armenia-Azerbaijan relations and the Nagorno-Karabakh peace talks?
Well, yes, the July clashes, the worst violence that we've seen since the April 2016 four-day war. Obviously, it's a given that each side frames it as an aggressive act and self-defense. But actually, I think the July clashes raise a number of very concerning issues for everyone involved in the conflict. First of all, the location of the clashes, a long way away from contested territory in Nagorno-Karabakh shows this dynamic, the broadening and widening of the conflict to the point where any space or issue can become a source of new violence. We also saw a very vigorous reaction from Turkey. That's not new, but I think we see this new impetus to the geopoliticization, drawing in outside powers into the conflict. And that's, I think, counters the trend of the last few years, 15 years or so, when the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict was actually rather exceptional in not drawing in outside powers in the same ways that other conflicts in Eurasia were doing. And then, as you're aware, we of course saw a lot of toxic mobilization amongst migrant and diaspora communities across the world. So what we're seeing is this kind of dynamic of totalization of the conflict and homogenization of identities, whereby anyone who identifies as Armenian Azerbaijani is implicated in a script of this conflict, a preconceived script, instead of being free to make up their own minds about what they feel about the conflict and ways out of it. So I think this is a very concerning trend, and I think it shows just how easily the dynamics can tip out of control for all parties.
Moving on from that, I'm curious, you spoke about the rhetoric coming from Ankara, from Turkey. Many are describing it as stronger than usual. Do you think that Armenia should be worried about this tone?
I think the broader question is about whether we should be concerned when we see outside powers kind of being drawn into the conflict. And I think, what we're seeing after July is an increasing framing of the conflict in terms of a Russia-Turkey dynamic. And I mean, my view on that is that any conflict that is framed in terms of a Russian Turkish rivalry is not going to end well for either Armenia or Azerbaijan. So, Russia and Turkey are two global regional powers that are invested in authoritarian models of managing conflict. They're both powers that have had a series of military successes, a lot of battle experience in the last few years. And they both have regimes that have enjoyed spikes in domestic legitimacy because of military success abroad. And I would also argue that although both powers have got important interests at stake in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, they're not necessarily vital interests. And so I think from the perspective of Baku and Yerevan, that's quite an uncertain horizon. And so I think what's important here is for Baku and Yerevan to take back some control and responsibility over the process, rather than leaving it open for external powers to come in and resolve the conflict, not on the Baku and Yerevan's terms, but on terms that suit them, as we saw in a different era in 1921.
I'm sure you saw Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan's recent interview on BBC's Hard Talk. He stated that strengthened monitoring mechanisms should be established. How realistic do you think this is?
Well, we know that formal agreement to strengthening the ceasefire regime has been on the table since May 2016. When Presidents Aliyev and Sargsyan formally, at least, agreed to that. And those agreements, of course, remain unfulfilled. Prime Minister Pashinyan and President Aliyev subsequently agreed in Dushanbe to some strengthening of the regime and to increased use of communication lines across the conflict. But what we've seen is that these are only used kind of after the fact, rather than for preventive messaging. As the International Crisis Group recently argued in their report, that these communication lines should be used preemptively for preventive messaging, rather than just for communicating once escalation has already started. Now, you're very well aware that for Azerbaijan, the idea of strengthening ceasefire infrastructure along the line of contact around Nagorno-Karabakh itself is seen as embedding an unacceptable status quo. And I don't think that position is going to change in the near future. But I think what the clashes in July have underlined is that there is scope to introduce some ceasefire strengthening infrastructure in that area, in the area of the international border between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And there are a number of arguments in support of that. First of all, neither side really has an interest in ceasefire failure in that area. It's close to important infrastructure, transportation, pipelines, and so on. And it's also quite densely populated on each side. So there's quite a lot to lose, in fact, from ceasefire failure in that area. Secondly, again, as International Crisis Group argued in their report, strengthening the ceasefire would benefit local populations in those areas, in Tavush and Tovuz, enabling agriculture, enabling the restoration of water infrastructure, and potentially stemming the process of emigration from those areas. And thirdly, there is a precedent for strengthening the ceasefire in that area. In 2010, the British-based organization Safer World actually pioneered a civilian ceasefire monitoring initiative in that area. So there is experience to draw upon. There are lessons to be learned. And I think this is a moment for Baku and Yerevan to demonstrate some pragmatism and to introduce some local measures strengthening the ceasefire in an area where their red lines are not actually involved.
You have written that after the 2018 revolution, both Aliyev and Pashinyan took a more reasonable and humanitarian approach, but since then it seems that things have soured. Why do you think this happened? And do you think there is a possibility of returning to that more reasonable atmosphere and approach?
Yeah, I think the Velvet Revolution allowed a lot of us to think that perhaps there could be a reset in the peace process. And I think in that honeymoon period that followed, there were perhaps some important misperceptions. In Azerbaijan, I think it was a misperception perhaps to see the change in terms of Armenia's liberation from a Karabakh clan that had been preventing a more compromising approach or a more amenability to compromise in the peace process. And I think it was a misperception in Armenia to think that suggesting that a solution should be acceptable to 3 societies and not just 2, that would be well received in Azerbaijan. So, I think there were a number of perhaps naive expectations at that time. But beyond that, I think what's important here is a lesson around the relationship between democratic breakthroughs and pre-existing conflict. So I think there has been an expectation that because there's been a democratic breakthrough in Armenia, that there would be a peace dividend. Now, of course, if democratic transitions are enacted and sustained across a conflict divide, if they have become consolidated transitions over the long term, then yes, you normally would expect a peace dividend. But the period immediately after a power transition is actually quite a risky time for situations where there's pre-existing conflict. You don't have an institutionalized transition yet, and leaders can feel tempted, I think, to draw on the emotive power of nationalism. And I think we've seen some of that in the Armenian case. And what we have today, essentially, is a new revolutionary regime in Armenia that wants to change everything from the bottom up. And in Azerbaijan, we've got an old regime that is very much oriented towards keeping things as they are. Both regimes, I think, entered the period of the pandemic with incomplete power consolidations. And that pandemic has, overlaid those pre-existing dynamics. The response of the Armenian government has been a topic of quite vigorous debate and criticism. And the pandemic, I think, also has quite serious long-term implications for Azerbaijan's political economy. So in that context, I think you can see why leaders have fallen back onto symbolic politics and onto the script of the Karabakh conflict, which is quite familiar ground for rallying populations around the flag.
So just a reminder, Dr. Broers' new book is entitled Armenia's Velvet Revolution, Authoritarian Decline and Civil Resistance in a Multipolar World. Dr. Broers, always a pleasure.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Emilio. It's great to be here.
And thank you for joining us on CivilNet.